Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on interim tax recruitment. I'm Amy Thomas, and I'm really pleased that you can join us today. So we're regularly asked, mainly by people in permanent roles, just what the mechanics of interim working is like. And so we thought we would actually just run a session to talk through this. So in today's session, we'll cover how the interim recruitment process works, the different types of payment and engagement of an interim, the benefits and considerations to think about of interim work, and how businesses use interim professionals. So, just to introduce ourselves, as I mentioned, I'm Amy Thomas. I've worked in interim recruitment for over 20 years, and the last 17 of those have been in tax. And I've focused very much on the in house tax side in the UK market, and that covers all strands of tax and across all levels as well. And joined today is Dahlia.
Hi there, I'm Dahlia Jennings, and I have worked in interim tax recruitment for over 20 years, as Amy often likes to remind me. I also have a focus on the in-house tax market, covering the softer sectors, so that includes sort of the consumer, retail, technology, and financial services, and cover all levels as well.
And then we're also joined by Michael.
Thank you, Amy. I think I've principally been invited for some comic relief, really, given Amy and Dahlia are the gurus when it comes to interim recruitment within Brewer Morris. But in seriousness, my role is effectively leading the Brewer Morris business in the UK, and I get involved in very senior tax hires on the permanent side. So I'm principally along just to address the question that we're often asked in terms of the relationship between interim and permanent and the impact of an interim assignment on longer term permanent career prospects.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Now we think if you've got any questions during the webinar, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please just type your questions in there, and we'll either answer them as we go along, or there is an opportunity at the very end to ask any questions as well. But if we can just start, Dahlia, if you want to just sort of maybe run through just what circumstances might somebody be in to consider an interim role?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, there's various reasons why people might find themselves available to consider interim work. It might be as a result of redundancy. It might be as a result of a change in personal circumstances. It could be sort of a relocation, either personal or a company relocating. I have to say it's been notable that more and more people have actually come to us to look for interim work as a lifestyle choice. Some of these people actually very much at the peak of their career. And I would say the interest in interim work has massively increased since the pandemic, when I think people really did question, what is important to them, reevaluated their sort of working styles, or a lot of people moved outside London. So I think that's been a notable increase. Other than that, it might happen following sort of a career break or even a career change, but to still sort of complement that career change. So those, I would say, are the reasons why people will look to consider an interim role.
Yeah, the lifestyle part is definitely one that I feel like I'm more familiar with. And what can an interim role actually bring somebody who is looking for that kind of work?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what the interim role can actually bring, I mean, first and foremost, I'd say it is sort of flexibility and offer sort of work-life balance. So as I touched upon, a lot of people will actually work and complement their sort of non-tax interests. So we've had people that are, running a property portfolio, people who are sort of doing landscape gardening, artists, drink manufacturers. I think we've probably seen it all, Amy, in our time. So it very much does sort of supplement, a slight change in career or non-tax interest. So I think we've covered the hybrid working piece. You'll often find you get more flexibility for sort of home working or perhaps part-time working arrangements. Less company team politics, less stress, staff management. Sometimes people come to us and say they've done their years, running big teams, and they actually want to work on a sort of more self-contained basis, and manage the sort of workload. Increased earning potential. I think that is certainly, if you're in a specialist area, I think that there can be, a way of obviously increasing earnings. Potential to sort of transfer to a permanent role, perhaps if you're not ready to commit to a permanent role, but want to sort of try before you buy and experience something on an interim basis with a view to it going permanent. So I would say, and generally I think to sort of develop, broaden skills or experience different sectors. So I'd say that is probably what an interim role can sort of bring you.
Yeah, it's really multifaceted, and I think the politics part is something that we hear a lot about and people really enjoy. Getting back to the technical part of a role. So just in terms of where the interim roles come up, under what circumstances does a business recruit an interim?
Yeah, so we look, often if there's sort of headcount or budget constraints, as a way of bypassing permanent headcount restrictions, companies will look to get in interims because normally there's a different approval for that hire. We've got the typical ones, resignation, parental leave, sick leave, your sort of busy periods, seasonal peaks to help out with year end, compliance deadlines, etc. Alternative to a big four secondee, I think that, we have a lot of clients coming to us saying, I have these, dare I say, astronomical quotes from a big four, and we're looking for an option and to see the sort of candidates that you could provide, often with the in-house skills and exposure. So we have special projects, M&A, risk reviews. Also clients coming, if there's sort of a first-time in-house tax hire, clients might not know the level of or type of resource they want. They might actually often bring someone in at a more senior level to put all the sort of processes in place with a view to hiring someone at a more junior level on a permanent, longer term basis. So I would say those tend to be the reasons why companies look to hire an interim.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so therefore, just moving on to what the process looks like for recruiting an interim tax professional. And to be fair, it's very similar to that of a permanent recruitment process, although there may be some aspects of a permanent recruitment process which are omitted. Things like maybe a psychometric test or multiple interviews. But once a role is registered, an interim person will have their CV go forward, and obviously we always ask for the person's authority to go forward for a role. So we never send a CV without authority. There will then be shortlisting and shortlisting for interviews, and there will always be at least a one-stage interview process. But I would say typically now I see a two-stage interview process. And these mostly happen via a video call, particularly the first stage, but we are seeing a growing movement towards a second stage interview being in person. Part of that can depend upon the location of the company and also the working arrangements in terms of number of days in the office. And like a permanent recruitment process, the role will go to an offer stage and an offer will be made to the successful candidate. Now then, getting on to probably the more technical parts of just how an interim tax professional is engaged and therefore paid by a business. And these are the questions that we typically get asked the most about. So depending on how an interim person is paid depends on how they are engaged. And there are two key ways of being engaged. One is through a fixed term contract, and the other way is through a day rate. So if I just look at the fixed term contract route, first of all, now Dahlia and I touched on earlier just how long we've been doing interim recruitment for, but I would say over the last couple of years, this fixed term contract, or FTC as we call it, is one of the most popular ways of engaging an interim person. And part of that is probably due to the duration that the interim people are now engaged on. So this is where the interim person has a contract direct with the client, and they join them like a permanent employee would. But the difference is that the contract is for a defined period of time, so there will be an end date on that contract. Under this method, the interim person will get a prorated salary of the annualized amount, but they will also get whatever benefits a permanent equivalent receives, but obviously just for that period of time. And there may have to be an allowance for settling in periods, like a 3 to 6 month settling in period. So the other allowances should be a car allowance, pension, private healthcare, and obviously holidays. And they would all be prorated to the duration as well. Now then, the other one, or the other way of being paid, is via a day rate. And this is where the services of the interim person are contracted through the agency and not with the client direct. This is probably seen as the more traditional method of payment and engagement of an interim person. This is where somebody would receive a daily rate, because that's the most common form of payment now, as opposed to an hourly rate. And they get paid for every day that somebody works. How this is calculated is through a timesheet, which is inputted weekly and is always authorized by a hiring manager. Now, just to complicate this further, there are three ways of how a day rate can be paid. But again, I'm covering these because these are the questions that we get asked the most about. And the three different methods of payment are on a PAYE day rate basis, an umbrella day rate basis, or through a limited company. I'm just going to touch on PAYE to start off with. Now, this is the most risk adverse method of payment. And under this, the interim person receives a base rate of pay plus a holiday pay amount, and they also get an auto enrollment pension amount. The second method I mentioned is through an umbrella company. And this is just to complicate it a little bit further. But this is where an intermediary company pays the interim's timesheets. So the recruitment company, us for example, would pay the umbrella company, who in turn pay the interim person. And this is all done via timesheet submissions. Under the umbrella company route, the umbrella company receives the base rate and holiday pay plus the employer's taxes and levies, and it is up to the umbrella company to pay the interim their pay and also the requirements through to HMRC. Finally, limited company route, and it's quite funny because this is, well, it's not funny, but it's quite interesting that this is probably the least used format of payment today, whereas it used to be quite common. And whenever I speak to people who are in a permanent role or who are thinking about the interim market, they always say, do I need to set up a company? And my advice would be no, or at least not yet. Because limited companies, they're also known as a personal services company, or PSC. But with the enforcement of the IR35 rules a couple of years ago, this method of payment is seen as being quite risky. And from that, that's why it's less commonly used. Under this method, the interim person receives the usual day rate and holiday and all the taxes, and it's paid into their company account. And they then have to calculate the taxes accordingly. So for the purposes of the webinar, I'm not going to go into these methods of payment in much more detail, but it just gives you a bit of an overview of what the different options are or the different methods, and they can be discussed on a more bespoke basis if you are looking to move into the interim market.
One thing we just haven't touched on there, Amy, is just bonuses and what you see in terms of bonuses within the interim space, particularly in that sort of FTC market. How are they treated?
Um, I don't have a straightforward answer for that because it's really different. For some FTCs, the client will build in a retention bonus. So somebody will receive a set amount at the end or on completion of the contract. If you leave the contract before that end date, you forfeit the
Yeah.
bonus. I have seen a full range of other examples. For example, I'm looking at a contract now where somebody will be joining after the start of the bonus calculation period and will be leaving before the payment date, and they are then not going to be falling into the
Eligible. Yeah.
bonus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some companies, I've had one recently where someone will be entitled to the bonus, but they will not be employed when it's paid out. So they'll be getting another payment about 3 months after they
Right.
finish.
Right.
Mm.
So it is really that there isn't a common method. It is really quite bespoke on the
Yeah.
client.
I suppose it's fair to say that on the sort of limited company or day rate perspective, that will all just be wrapped up in the total charge. There's not a sort of
Yeah.
separate bonus point.
On
Yeah.
a day rate should normally come in above a permanent equivalent
Yeah.
salary and should account for those areas. Under PAYE and under the agency worker regulation, which I really don't want to start and get too technical and go into, but under AWR, there is a bonus entitlement. So that is something to think about when looking at that. So now then, if I just cover off notice periods as well. Now, under a typical day rate assignment, there technically is not a notice period because of the sheer nature of the flexibility of interim working. However, this just isn't really practical. And particularly when you're recruiting in the areas of tax, that's not professional. So we ask as a minimum that somebody works a 1 week notice, and actually that's vice versa to the client, to the candidate. Or if they are able to give more notice, then that's seen as really quite favourable. Having said that, I would say the majority of my day rate contracts, we actually build in a longer notice period, and that can be up to, say, a month. Under an FTC, the notice period can really vary, and that will depend on the duration of the contract. But I would typically say that for a 6 months FTC, we would see a 1 month notice period. And then closer to 12 months on an FTC, we would see more of a 3 months notice period. And then in terms of looking at the duration of an interim role, um, there's always a difference between the duration that we register when we take in the role and then what actually does end up happening. Normally, it ends up being a lot longer than what we initially are advised, just because contracts do get extended quite typically. But long gone are the days of a 2 week interim position. We don't see anything under 3 months. And if anything, the roles that we register are typically between 6 to 12 months in duration. Now, then, in terms of tax, just thinking about the areas of tax that people tend to be contracted into. And like I said before, we cover all strands and levels, but there are a couple of areas where we see a higher volume of interim positions. Those are in UK corporate tax compliance, particularly in the management of the compliance process and managing outsourced providers and then the review of returns. Tax reporting, particularly for year end sort of requirements, And then VAT and VAT compliance. Now, over the first 6 months of this year, VAT interim has been a really busy area for us, with the focus being around process improvement and automation. But VAT is a real mainstay of our interim world. Next, international tax. That's been a really busy area for us. And this can include compliance management, but also through to restructuring work and business partnering. And then we've recruited this year to some quite specific projects. So on M&A and particular transactions, and also to legal entity rationalisation projects as an example. And then we also just cover the more BAU types of roles where a permanent vacancy exists, but they need some interim cover. So this can be anything from like a UK tax manager through to a head of tax. Now, another area of interim recruitment we are looking at is fractional. And fractional recruitment isn't BAU. And this is a bit more of a newer idea of interim recruitment, albeit we have recruited to this area for quite some time, but we're just starting to divisionalize it a little bit more. And in this area, this is a very flexible working arrangement where a tax professional would typically have come from quite a senior tax position previously, say a head of tax, tax director, tax consultant. And they tend to be hired by more than one organization on a part-time basis. So it's not full-time hours, and their tax knowledge is really contracted for the business or for businesses on sort of quite specific niche areas. So for businesses hiring such a person, it allows them to have access to high level expertise without the cost of a full-time hire. And in many circumstances, this can prove to be cost effective, especially if the cost is versus what might be seen as a senior level secondee at maybe director level. Quite often, a fractional arrangement will be paid on an hourly basis because it is really quite part-time and the hours may vary from week to week, and so the hours are charged accordingly. And examples of areas of where we've looked at fractional working have been on supporting a business on, say, a tax dispute, working on a particular transaction, or even in areas where somebody has provided industry specific tax advice. And that we've looked at that more in the oil and gas and real estate areas, but that's not to say it can't be opened up to other areas. And then also where we've had somebody support a new head of tax, maybe on the more technical mentoring side. So that's just a bit more about the mechanicals or the mechanics behind interim working, which can be a little bit dry, I appreciate. But Dahlia, do you want to maybe talk about just what it takes for someone to succeed in an interim role?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, look, in order to succeed in an interim role, and it doesn't suit everyone, you know, being honest, but the sort of attributes and traits that I think it's important to have if you're going to look to this market is flexibility. So this is sort of flexibility in terms of location, sector, duties, to see as many sort of roles as possible, and to, you know, get different types of sort of exposure. And also sort of you have to kind of deal with that uncertainty and ambiguity because, you know, you don't always know the duration of an interim role. You might be coming into an environment where there's lots going on and you have to really sort of work quite autonomously and pick different things up. So I think you need to be prepared to, you know, get your hands dirty and deal with some sort of uncertainty. Look, I think it's really important to sort of learn as much as you can in interim roles, ask questions to your sort of colleagues, leaders, collaborate, and that, you know, while you sort of bring that technical expertise to the position. So I guess soak up what is around you and use it to gain different experience and experience sort of different sectors. And I think also, you know, you need like a can-do attitude, an ability to sort of communicate with people at all levels, and be able to work autonomously, I think, when required.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The flexibility piece, being open-minded to looking at lots of different opportunities will possibly aid the ambiguity aspect.
Mm.
Um, but obviously there are always drawbacks to every situation. So Dahlia, what sort of drawbacks are there for interim working?
Yeah, look, I think the drawbacks are that we can't sort of guarantee, continuous employment. So you have to be prepared for gaps between roles. So there is uncertainty, and some people quite like this, but some people can't deal with this. So it's an unpredictable market, and often we'll get people saying to us, will you be able to find me a role when I finish this 6 month role? And the truth is that we can't. So you have to be prepared for some gaps. Um, dependent on your sort of general work pattern. Look, some people feel the pressure, I guess, to deliver immediately on a project, and have to kind of come in and add value quite quickly. So that can also be another drawback. And I think it can just take a bit of time, to really understand who the key influencers are in an organization. And it's also about learning, the general sort of dynamics of the team. And some people can say they don't always feel as integral to the team as, they did in permanent roles. Some people like that, but some people find that harder. So it's about navigating, and it's about matching it up to, I guess, what you're looking for and what suits different personalities, and also people at different stages of their career. Right, so I think now we have obviously covered a lot on the interim market, and we're going to pass over to Michael, who will talk about the impact of working on an interim basis from a permanent perspective.
Yeah, I'll just spend a few moments just talking about the impact on a sort of CV and the conversations that we'll have with CFOs about head of tax roles. And I'd love to say there's absolutely no impact and that you can go from an interim role to a permanent role at the drop of the hat. I think there's no getting away from the reality that a career contractor will struggle to get the top job. If I'm sat in front of a FTSE 100 CFO, they're looking to de-risk the hire as best as possible. And if someone has had multiple interim roles over a period of time, that raises question marks as to whether A, they would be able to fit back into a permanent role, or B, whether they just be frustrated quickly and move back into that interim position. So I do think there's a risk associated with going into the interim space if you are targeting that FTSE 100 head of tax search. So I say, if you're a career contractor, that maybe is a little bit limiting for permanent roles. So if I was to define when it would become a problem for a CFO, I would say that if you've been doing more than 3 or 4 years in an interim role and have got 3 or 4 assignments or more in that time, it becomes quite challenging for me to have a conversation about a permanent role with a CFO at that stage. That being said, I think there's 2 really clear situations at the moment where being interim is actually advantageous and can be really, really helpful in terms of securing that permanent role. I don't think it's any secret that it's been a candidate-led market over the last 18 months or so, and there've been more candidates available than there have been jobs, many of whom, through no fault of their own, we touched on redundancy at the start of this session. Those people are immediately available. Clients are able to de-risk a hire. Someone who's immediately available goes into the role on an interim basis. It's almost a 6-month interview process. They do a tremendous job. A lot of the time, we then don't even see a permanent process run because we know that interim has developed fantastic internal buy-in. They've delivered on what they said they were going to do, and they've enjoyed where they are. So the cultural fit's strong. So it's a fantastic way of de-risking a hire on a permanent basis. I think the second area that's really advantageous is when there are gaps in a skill set. And so, particularly in the big FTSEs, you'll find really siloed skill sets. You'll have a head of compliance reporting who's maybe a little bit light on international tax, or you'll have an M&A specialist who maybe hasn't touched on transfer pricing or indirect tax. Those individuals, an interim role in perhaps a smaller company to really round out the skill set can be an amazing way of getting a foot into the door for a head of tax job down the track. So I think you have to have in your mind, if I'm going to be a contractor for 10 years, that's very much a lifestyle choice. that's going to impact your longer term permanent career prospects. But I think if you're looking at it as I'm thinking of interim because I'm immediately available unexpectedly, or because I think actually there's some career or lifestyle situations that have impacted me. I think if you're strategic about it, it can be a wonderful addition to a CV. So we have had a few sort of questions that have been sort of feeding through as we've done this. So if there are questions that have come up, please do sort of populate those in now as well, and I'll sort of ask Dahlia and Amy just some questions around those. One of the first ones that's come in is that interested in exploring the interim market, but have a 3-month notice period. How restrictive is that, and what's the best methodology and way of approaching it?
Yeah, we get asked this question a lot, I have to say. We do get a lot of calls from people saying, I'm interested to explore the market, but in a permanent role. Being honest, 3-month notice periods are very difficult to overcome. In terms of interim roles, whilst some of them will be starting immediately, I would say majority will be starting within a month. And to wait for 3 months from point of sort of resignation, I guess, when you secure the offer, it is often too long. And then obviously we get people saying, would you advise me to leave my permanent role on the basis I'll find something on the interim side? And the truth is that it's a very personal decision. But again, we can't guarantee anything. So 3 months notice periods and normally will stop you looking at the interim market. 1 month notice periods we can often work around.
Yeah, and I suppose the other question that we have with that is I know I'm being made redundant and my end date is September or October, whenever it may be. When can I start looking at the interim market? We're typically finding turnaround times of a week or two in these processes, aren't we? So again, if you know it's September, October that you're available for start, it's probably not going to be June or July that we're putting interim roles in front of you.
Yeah, I'd say the exception is often maternity cover because you do get quite a good lead time. So I'm working on 2 senior maternity covers that are not starting till sort of September, October time. So there are exceptions, but on the whole, we will work with someone probably a month or 2 before their end and availability date.
Okay. Amy, are you seeing particular industries that are active in the interim space? Are there sectors that are more active than others? We touched on obviously the specialisms in tax that are needed, but are there sectors that are doing more than others?
I think when it comes to industries, it can depend on maybe different market forces as to why an industry will be busier. But actually, I would say it's really quite broad across the full spectrum of industries. On the in-house side, we've been very busy in areas like real estate, construction, media, IT, technology, life sciences, even on the more environmental side as well. There are, over the time of recruiting, there are a lot of businesses I never thought would be a business and have got an in-house tax person and have therefore resulted in an interim person. So there aren't any particular industries at the moment which are busier than others. I think one notable area that probably both Dara and I did used to recruit a lot into many years ago was sort of like the retail banking sector. And they don't hire the same number of interim people that they used to. But to compensate for that, Dahlia and I recruit to some really interesting businesses. And it really is quite a broad spectrum, IT, retail, online shopping. When you think about retail and you think about the changes in employer tax this year, we've still had recruitment into their tax teams. So that hasn't dampened down the market at all.
Okay. I'm very mindful that we're overrunning a touch, aren't we?
We have overrun.
We have a final question though for you before.
Right.
So just in terms of best time to look for an interim role, busiest time of the year, is there a peak?
There are, I would say actually at the moment, there are quieter times. So tend to be over the longer school holidays, tend to be slightly quieter times, but that's just a mere fact of decision makers not being as active. Ever since COVID, the traditional times or peaks in the year has really changed. And as someone I heard put it to me a couple of weeks ago, no 2 years in recruitment have been the same since. One interesting anomaly, though, is just how busy we have been over the last 5 to 6 years over the summer period. So we tend to work with a lot of people who are on the interim market as a lifestyle choice, who do like to take the summer period off, and will be on holiday or extended leave, but we will be securing them a role for a September, October start. So actually, July and August have been quite busy for us typically. January can be quite a quiet period. So if you're wanting to look at a role that starts in January, you probably need to be looking around November time. Um, but otherwise, our demand, we never can really predict when something is going to come through. And it's a difference between one right role or a couple of roles to have an option of. And that's where Dahlia talking about the flexibility and being able to consider all options is really quite key.
Yeah, great.
So I think, yes, we have overrun. And just to conclude, really, we've explored the reasons behind interim work, how it works, and we've provided some areas to reflect on and what to consider and if this is right for you. If anyone listening would like to discuss their personal situation with regards to interim work with Dahlia or I, please do get in touch with us. We would be delighted to have a more bespoke conversation. This webinar is recorded, so feel free to ask for a recording of it as well. But just thank you very much for joining our discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.